All right, let's get started. I wanted to remind you of something that I mentioned on the first day of the class. Right, we used last time's discussion of Moby Dick in some sense to give you a sense of where we were going in the course, sort of a sense of to get you invested in some of the issues now that are going to become important later on. In the past, students have wondered why it was that we were slogging through a lot of the different Puritan forms and what the payoff was. And I wanted you to see right away that some of the ideas that the Puritans bring to the New World and that haunt them continue to haunt writers all the way up through Herman Melville. A writer like Emerson, perhaps, we will see, tries to swerve away in the aftermath of the Enlightenment and the beginning of Romanticism, away from this sense of Puritan, what Melville calls sense of innate depravity, right? That puritanic gloom. But writers like Hawthorne and Melville think that the swerve away from these things that Emerson, perhaps Thoreau and Whitman take is a little too quick, perhaps, a little too easy. That what we need to do if we are thinking people is to contend with whatever the residue of Puritanism has become by the time we get to the middle of the 19th century. So we're going to circle back now and think about the very earliest moments of settlement and give a kind of quick sketch of the way that settlement worked, and then specifically talk a little bit more about Puritanism to prepare you for your reading for the weekend. So Christopher Columbus, right? 1492 is his first voyage. We all know that. That's drilled into us when we are growing up. But I wanted to emphasize again a conjunction that I mentioned the first day, which is that the Gutenberg Bible, right? Basically the first printed book in Europe, is the same era as Columbus, right? Columbus is born 3 years before the first Gutenberg Bible is printed. In fact, it's probably in preparation in around 1450. So they are contemporaries. And I don't think that's an accident. I mean, the creation of the printing press so that manuscripts don't have to be copied by hand anymore it's a brand new technology that in some sense revolutionizes the flow of information. More people will now have access to text, and it has an incredible ripple effect through Western culture. It makes writing crucial to the whole process of settlement. So as I think I mentioned the first day, all of these sailors are also writers. They're constantly keeping track of things. They're sending letters back to their patrons. And what we will start to see is the growth of something like a reading public in the years we are talking about, right? So I want you to understand this is the great so-called age of discovery. It's also the great age of text. There are some who think we might be on the verge of some other great age of something else. The transformation of text from print to something else may herald a kind of information revolution. It's possible. We'll have to see how it plays out. Although I'm interested in conjunctions of digital media and textuality. Does the word iPad mean anything to anybody? As of 1 o'clock, it apparently exists. And it's the latest cutting edge Apple device, and yet it is all about textuality. It's about representing text in a way that will enable it to be sort of more modern, give us a greater opportunity to interact with it. People say that English professors ought to worry about the whatever you want to call it, the Googleization of the world or the Kindleization. I don't think so. I think there's going to be more need for people to study the way that literature and text work because there's going to be more people with access to text and many different kinds of text than there used to be. So we're going to go back to the Great Age, the beginning of textuality. And this is one conjunction I wanted to remind you of. Another conjunction is this one, Shakespeare, right? Shakespeare is writing, say, 100 or so years after this. But the English are very slow to become involved in the business of American colonization, right? So Shakespeare writes The Tempest in 1611, one of his last plays, the last great romance, and it's inspired by the story of a wreck that actually took place in the Bermudas. So that you might say the very end of Shakespeare's career coincides with the start of the age of colonization. So that's another echo that we want to bear in mind. Shakespeare also, in some sense, hovers over our course for this reason, and also because, as you see, part of what Melville thinks he is doing in writing Moby Dick is to bring a Shakespearean project finally to American culture. A modern Shakespearean project, not one for the early 17th century, but one that befits the modern age, in other words, the middle of the 19th century. And therefore, he's going to use a different kind of literary technology, the novel. And he's going to be thinking about the relationship between the novel and drama, as you will discover. So I want us to keep this in mind as well. The English, as I said, were slow to become involved in the business of American colonization. A couple of brothers named John and Sebastian Cabot had sailed for English merchants in the reign of Henry VII and Henry VIII, but it didn't go well for them. John was lost at sea in 1498, and Sebastian went to work for Spain. They paid better, I guess, in 1512. It wasn't really until the 1570s that there was real English interest in the New World, and again, things didn't go very well. Martin Frobisher, Humphrey Gilbert explored the north of America with very little success. Sir Walter Raleigh oversaw the famous colony of Roanoke in 1584, and Arthur Barlow, who was one of the men that Raleigh dispatched, gave this account of what they found. He said this: "The 2nd of July we found shoal water, where we smelled so sweet and so strong a smell as if we had been in the midst of some delicate garden, abounding with all kinds of odoriferous flowers, by which we were assured that the land could not be far distant." Now, the Europeans bring things with them to the New World. As you've all famously heard, disease would be one of them. I suppose Christian ideology might be another. But they also brought what we might think of as a rhetoric of wonder. They had a kind of template in their mind for what they were going to find. Some of them thought they might find the Fountain of Youth. Some of them thought they might find the Garden of Eden. But they expected to be amazed. And so a lot of the discourse of settlement that you would find from all of in the different European traditions partakes in this discourse of wonder, the marvelous. And that's part of it, right? We get to shoal water. We can't quite see the land, but we smell this incredibly sweet smell, so we think the New World must be nearby. So Raleigh and Barlow take possession of Roanoke for Elizabeth I. They spend about 6 weeks exploring the shore, then they return to England. The next year they come back and plant a colony. Its governor, Richard Grenville, has a way of alienating the native inhabitants. And there's an expedition famously to Roanoke that's led by a man named John White in 1590. What does he discover when he gets to Roanoke? Do you study this in high school? Yeah.
It's totally abandoned.
It's gone. It's still people say it's still a mystery exactly what happened to them. Among the missing people were White's own daughter and her family. And in fact, White wrote an account, it used to be in the Norton, but I don't think it's there anymore, in which he describes his discovery of the ruined colony, and he includes a kind of poignant account of finding 3 of his own storage chests torn apart. Oh, this was the Barlow quote. I think I brought the White. He says, "Many of my things lay spoiled and broken, and my books torn from the covers, the frame of some of my pictures and maps rotten and spoiled with rain, and my armor almost eaten through with rust." That's the beginning of this description. And then he says this: "At my departure, I willed them that if they should happen to be distressed in any of those places, when they should carve over the letters or name a cross in this form. But we found no such sign of distress." Again, it was kind of a mystery. And having well considered of this, we passed towards the place where they were left in sundry houses, but we found the houses taken down, and the place very strongly enclosed with a high palisade of great posts, with curtains and flankers, which are defensive walls, very fort-like. And one of the chief trees or posts at the right side of the entrance had the bark taken off, and 5 feet from the ground, in fair capital letters, was graven Croatoan, without any cross or sign of distress. "Many of my things," and this is the passage I had just read to you, "many of my things lay spoiled and broken. My books torn from the covers, the frames of some of my pictures and maps rotten and spoiled with rain, and my armor almost eaten through with rust. This could be nothing but the work of our enemies at Dassamunkapuk, who must have watched the departure of our men to Croatoan, and as soon as they were departed, dug up every place where they suspected anything was buried." White searches around, but the bad weather prevents him from doing too much to look for his family, and he never finds out what has actually happened to them. In 1606, there's a second Virginia colony which is set up, and then the first permanent settlement in North America is established at Jamestown in Virginia in 1607, and that becomes the start of that sort of Virginia trajectory that was one of the ones that Thomas Bender talks about. A later voyage in 1609 becomes famous when its flagship, the Sea Adventure, is wrecked before reaching Virginia, and that is the voyage and the wreck that inspires Shakespeare's Tempest. Okay, so that's the story, you might say, of the English in North America. But of course, the colonization of the North and South begins with Columbus. And so I wanted to take a little bit, take a look at the writing that we have from Columbus's voyages. If you have your first volume of the Norton, take it out and open to page 32, which is the letter to Louise de Saint-Angel regarding the first voyage. So this is written basically back to his patron's agent. Saint-Angel is a Spanish treasurer, and Columbus wants to impress him with the success of the voyage, right? So this is basically a report to his employer. Sir, as I know that you will be pleased at the great victory with which our Lord has crowned my voyage, I write this to you, from which you will learn how, in 33 days, I passed from the Canary Islands to the Indies with the fleet which the most illustrious king and queen, our sovereigns, gave to me. And there I found very many islands filled with people innumerable, and of them all I have taken possession for their highnesses by proclamation made, and with the royal standard unfurled, and no opposition was offered to me. And then he talks about naming. What do you immediately notice about the language of this? As you know, I will be pleased at the great victory. What do we say about this? I mean, I'm calling this the literature of settlement. Sound good to you? What is the language that he's using here? How would you characterize it if you had to? Yes?
It's language of appeasement.
Language of appeasement?
I mean, yeah.
How? In what way appeasement?
It's a lot of like you can kind of detect like the pressure under like the officials and stuff to like.
So he's sucking up a bit.
Like, yeah, basically.
Okay, yeah, he wants to, again, it's a letter to his employer, and he wants to impress him. So there's something, he is perhaps trying to appease his employer's, make sure that he's fulfilled his employer's wishes. Yes?
Well, along with that, he's trying to like appease their wishes, but you can also sense sort of his responsibilities.
Mm-hmm.
So he gets to the point where he says, and I should have taken possession of their highnesses.
Okay.
Proclamation. Like he knows his role there. He knows what he needs.
Very good, very good. He says, he knows his role. It's self-promoting, right? I have taken possession for their royal highnesses. Right. Good, that's good. Anything else? Yes?
It describes the conquest, but just with passive language.
Very good. It's not even that passive. It's conquest. I mean, you're right. It's conquest. It's martial language. At the first sentence, you'll be pleased at the great victory. I went there. I took possession. I unfurled the royal standard, and nobody made any opposition. Just try for a moment to think of it from the standpoint of the people that are watching this happen. You know, a guy comes out, trudges, he's dressed in a way they've never seen before, takes out this thing, sticks it on the beach, says some words in a barbaric language. Beginning of the end, if they could only have seen what was going to happen, they'd have killed him right there. But that's not what happened. And I think that's right. Look what he sees. He sees people innumerable. Okay? And one of the things to say about Columbus's letters is that he really portrays himself as a primary kind of actor. This is in some sense a drama of discovery, and it's his discovery. Right? So there's a certain way in which he's instantiating here a whole genre of personal narrative that we're going to be seeing throughout the course that's going to finally culminate for us in Call Me Ishmael. Let's take a look at the end of the passage, and we'll see. Let's go to the next paragraph. He says, when I reached Juana, I followed its coast to the westward, and I found it to be so extensive that I thought it must be the mainland, the province of Catayo. And you can look at your footnote and see what that means. He thinks he's in Cathay or China. They didn't know what they thought they were looking for another way to get to China. China had been discovered. Marco Polo and others had brought things back to Europe from China, like spaghetti. And so They were looking for another way to get to China. They had no idea at first that there was this continent. There's a wonderful thing. I should have brought a picture of it. Maybe I'll do it next time. It's called the Christopher Columbus chart. And I think it's in the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris now. But it's a weird hybrid thing of an actual, we would call an actual sea chart. So that something that would look recognizably to us like a map on one side. I think if you're looking, it's on the right side. But then on the left side, kind of joined to it, is what they call these portolan charts, which are kind of much more about mythical places, and they have kind of sea beasts and other things sort of there, the edge of the world kind of stuff. And it's really interesting to look at this. I'll definitely bring it. And see these things just kind of literally joined, as if glued together to make this thing. It's not even regular in shape. You can see that what they're on the verge of is a kind of paradigm shift in the way that they understand the world works, right? Not flat, but round. All the things, sun at the center of the universe, not so much. And early on, people were burned to the stake for thinking these things. We're at the great age of discovery. That doesn't only mean looking for land. People are thinking of different things, and paradigms are shifting. And that chart is a wonderful way of thinking of Columbus as a kind of guy who's right in the middle of a sort of shift in the way of understanding and conceiving the world. Much more so, actually, than he first understands here. So he says, since there were neither towns nor villages on the seashore, but only small hamlets with the people of which I could not have speech, because they all fled immediately. I mean, what would you do, right? I went forward on the same course, thinking that I should not fail to find great cities and towns. Again, he thinks he's in China. And at the end of many leagues, seeing that there was no change and that the coast was bearing me northwards, which I wished to avoid, since winter was already beginning, and I proposed to make from it to the south, and as moreover the wind was carrying me forward, I determined not to wait for the change in the weather and retrace my path as far as a certain harbor known to me. And from that point I sent 2 men inland to learn if there were a king or great cities. They traveled 3 days' journey and found an infinity of small hamlets and people without number, but nothing of importance. Okay, that's too obvious. What would we say about that? I mean, what has he also brought with him from Europe? What conception is clear here? Yeah?
What's this idea of civilization that doesn't account for anything that's not the Western, which doesn't really make sense in this context,
right?
Because they're more Western. But this
well, they thought they were going to the East, remember? So he thinks he's in the East, but yes.
It's idea of European civilization, that if it doesn't exist within that distinction, then it doesn't exist at all. They're not civilized.
Right, that's very good. In other words, he has a conception of Western civilization that he's brought with him. It means to be civilized, you can see some of the things he's expecting to find. If you're a civilization, you got a king. If you're a civilization, you have to have great cities. And presumably you have many of the other things that are going along with that, right? A kind of aristocracy, a certain mode of social organization, and writing will be one of the things that the Europeans are expecting you to have if you're going to be calling yourself a civilized person or a civilized society. Did you want to add something?
I was going to add there's an overbearing pride or hubris that's almost universal. It's also found every time in the writings of Smith and comes to America.
Yeah, sure. I mean, all of these people have a certain kind of hubris, but you might say that Smith is even more hubristic than most. I mean, he's really a self-promoter. Columbus looks very humble compared to him. But I think there's a hubris that they don't even understand, right? It's the moment of, as we would call it, first contact, and they have no idea that the people that they are encountering are, in fact, should count as people. Well, he calls them people here. They're people without number, but not of importance, not worth reckoning with. Yes?
Yeah, Professor, that's interesting that even from the very beginning, when they hadn't really thought about these people and their civilization or lack of civilization,
Mm-hmm.
the fact that he keeps calling them innumerable and not important is like already giving the idea that they don't see them as
Mhm.
the same species, which becomes a debate for
Well, yes, and then that's right. It's almost like they don't see them as these people innumerable as the same species. And later on, the subtext is that he sees them, in fact, as something else. Let's go on to the very end. He's starting to describe what it's like. So let's go to about the middle of the long paragraph at the top of 33. The island and all the others are very fertile to a limitless degree, and this island is extremely so. Again, it's a kind of progress report. He wants to prove that everything there, it was worthwhile, all the expense of sending these ships out there. In it, there are many harbors on the coast of the sea beyond comparison with others, which I know in Christendom, and many rivers, good and large, which is marvelous, right? So he's using what he knows. predictable that you do this. Knows Christendom, as it were, is your benchmark, and you're going to compare what you find to that. And he thinks what he's found is better. Again, that word, marvelous. It's all marvelous. Its lands are high, and there are in it many sierras and very lofty mountains beyond comparison with the island of Tenerife. All are beautiful, of 1,000 shapes, and all are accessible and filled with trees of 1,000 kinds and tall, and they seem to touch the sky. And I am told that they never lose their foliage, as I can understand, for I saw them as green and lovely as they are in Spain in May, and some of them are flowering, some bearing fruit, and some in another stage according to their nature. And the nightingale was singing, and other birds of 1,000 kinds in the month of November, there where I went. There are 6 or 8 kinds of palm, which are a wonder to behold on account of their beautiful variety, but so are the other trees and fruits and plants. What's wrong with that account? It says he hears a nightingale, and it's wonderful, and yeah.
Well, I think what's interesting is, I think he compares to the map that you forgot to bring. Let us all download. Where it's just like the clash of kind of strict, like, come back, man. I wasted on you. I'm sorry.
I think that's an example of what goes around comes around. Raise your hand when you think of it. I was asking what's wrong with that account in the back.
He's placing more importance on fruits and animals and the people.
Well, that's true. That's certainly true. Although, yeah, well, we'll wait till we get to a slightly later sentence. Is there anything else that's a little dodgy about this? Yes. You got it. Good.
The clash of like the literature of like wonder and awe.
Uh-huh.
Like that's meeting the just like the literature of like practicality that like with many rivers which are like the rivers are marvelous, yes, because of their beauty, but also because like there's kind of a sense of utility that's, you know, like we'll be able to use these rivers.
That's very point was worth waiting for. Yes, he's looking at them all as commodities, right? This is resources we've discovered here. It's amazing. It's better than what we have at home. Now, again, I'm still looking for what's dodgy about the account, though. Yeah. Yeah. See, they tricked you because they stick the footnote a couple of sentences later to talk about the honeymoon, but there's no nightingales. That's one of the big Keats, Ode on a Nightingale, Ode to a Nightingale. Everybody read that? Britlet 2, they still do that? Ode to a Nightingale. That's one way in a nutshell of talking about a problem that we're going to encounter later on. You know, how the hell are you supposed to write a literature here in this continent where there are no nightingales? What the heck are we going to write about? How are we going to have a Gothic literature when there's no castles, there's no aristocracy, presumably there's no ghosts and vampires and things like that here in the New World? What are we supposed to do? So Columbus doesn't actually notice that. He hears something, he figures it must be. So what I want you to see is there's a kind of template in place for understanding. And part of that template is being used to create a sense of awe and wonder. This place is different. It's unlike what we have. But really he's not attuned to the differences. He's just saying it's different because it's more, it's better, we can use it. And when he has an opportunity to note something that's got to be a different kind of bird, no. A certain part of his brain just simply maps the old world onto the new. And one of the issues that we're going to be discovering is the extent to which that can become a kind of dangerous thing to do. That there are certain ways in which, how many of you have seen the now top grossing movie in all of history? Avatar? None of you have seen Avatar? Oh, come on. I should make it an assignment. You go see Avatar. You go see Avatar. You think I'm joking. You go see Avatar in 3D IMAX. You get a sense of wonder. You'll understand something about Columbus by seeing that movie. You go to and it's all, what is that movie except for settlement and discovery and dances with Smurfs? Actually, that was a cheap shot because I love that movie. I think the movie is brilliant. I have colleagues who think, it's not progressive enough. They should have done more with kind of echo this and echo that and hybridity. And I'm thinking for a piece of popular art, it's pretty progressive. You go away thinking, don't wreck the trees. Be sympathetic to your animals. I think that's all pretty good stuff. But the sense of wonder, who has seen it? Come on. You've not, wait a minute. You all just saw it in the last minute? You weren't willing to confess because you clearly have not heard enough about me. But remember, so those of you who have seen it, I'm not going to spoil it for those of you who haven't. I'm serious that you should go see it, though, because it partakes in the same discourse of wonder, and then it's wonder that if you don't understand it in the right way, it will kill you. That's part of what they discover here, right? That planet, the tough Marine colonel who's there says, Pandora, place will kill you. Like, he's a battle-scarred veteran, right? Except that the scars he got are from his first day on this new world. But the sense of wonder is captured in that film where the crippled protagonist suddenly gets his avatar body and starts to run again. And I think just that whole sequence where he starts to understand the joy of using his legs again in this kind of new context. That's part of this whole thing. I mean, Cameron is actually drawing on the same discourse of wonder that marks these texts. And that's, for my money, it's a better account of first contact and finding, or just the aftermath of first contact and what it's like to be in a new world, than that really arty movie that was called The New World, which just went on. About Pocahontas went on and on. Okay, that's my little editorializing. Hey, but I like pop art. I'm very serious, though, about going to see Avatar. If you were feeling like it was not worth your time or your 12 or 16 bucks or however it was, just say, I'm going because it's my American Lit 1 assignment. Seriously. But take a look again, and again the comparison is right. They go to, this is a joke, they go, it's the movie's joke, they go to this place to find some MacGuffin resource that's called unobtainium. But, they are unable to see the wonder of that world. Really, what blocks them from truly understanding the wonder of the world is that they see it really as resources. Many of the people the reason that they're there. And that's what Columbus does too, this nightingale business. Was singing in 1,000 kinds of words. There are 8 kinds of palm, which are a wonder to behold on account of their beautiful variety, but so are other trees and fruits and plants. In it are marvelous pine groves, and there are very large tracts of cultivatable lands, and there is honey. And there are birds of many kinds and fruits and great diversity. Did I say there were birds? Right, he says, he's getting it across. In the interior are mines of metals, and the population is without number. Hispaniola is a marvel. The last thing he mentions, there's mines of metals, and of course we're going to need people to get those mines of metals out, right? So luckily there are people without number. There's a kind of sinister side now, we would say, to this document. The drama of Columbus's life is that he actually comes to understand what you might say is the dark underside of this conception of civilization. The first voyage, let me see, did I bring the voyages? Yes. So he makes 4 voyages, right? He raises money for a second voyage in 1493, but he's racked with doubts that begin when he discovers that the small settlement that he's left back in this place that's a marvel has been massacred. His third voyage in 1498 is marked by his own ill health and by increasingly chaotic conditions back on Hispaniola. In fact, at the end of this third voyage, he is stripped of all of his properties and sent back to Spain in chains. I bet you didn't know that about the Columbus story. He finally gets his reputation back and has a 4th voyage in 1502 that is in fact a complete disaster. And it sees him finally stranded in Jamaica, and that's where he writes this letter directly now to the king, Ferdinand and Isabella, regarding the 4th voyage on the bottom of 33. Of Hispaniola, Paria, and the other lands, I never think without weeping, he writes. I believe that their example would have been to the profit of others. On the contrary, they are in an exhausted state. Although they are not dead, the infirmity is incurable or very extensive. Okay, so how many years is this? 11 years later? Let him who brought them to this state come now with the remedy if he can, or if he knows it. In destruction, everyone is an adept. It was always the custom to give thanks and promotion to him who imperiled his person. Now he's again his own situation. He's talking about the injustices done to him, but he's also talking about the cultural situation. It is not just that he who has been so hostile to this undertaking should enjoy its fruits, or that his children should. Those who have left the Indies, flying from toils and speaking evil of the matter and me, have returned with official employment. So it has now been ordained in the case of Aragua. It is an ill example and without profit for the business and for the justice of the world. And then he goes on, right? So you can see that Columbus learns firsthand what it means to put your faith in things like kings and great cities. And there's a way in which Columbus is emerging out of these letters as the first of a kind of type. the first kind of alienated American or the first American exile, perhaps. Now, the guy who prepared a summary of Columbus's first voyage, it survives today as the Diario of Christopher Columbus, was a sailor on the first voyage who later became a monk, and we might say the kind of first New World activist on behalf of Native Americans. And that's the next writer that's featured in the Norton, Bartolomé de las Casas. And you get, I asked you to take a look at this. On the bottom of 36, you get an excerpt from his very brief relation of the devastation of the Indies. And you can see, how quickly Europeans have altered the way the New World is. This was the first land in the New World to be destroyed and depopulated by the Christians. And you got to remember that by this time he's a monk, right? He is a Christian. And here they began their subjection of the women and children, taking them away from the Indians to use them and ill-use them, eating the food they provided with their sweat and toil. The Spaniards did not content themselves with what the Indians gave them of their own free will, according to their ability, which was always too little to satisfy enormous appetites. For a Christian eats and consumes in one day an amount of food that would suffice to feed 3 houses inhabited by 10 Indians for 1 month. A bit of an exaggeration, but you see the point he's trying to make. And they committed other acts of force and violence and oppression which made the Indians realize that these men had not come from heaven. Some of the Indians concealed their foods, while others concealed their wives and children, and still others fled to the mountain to avoid the terrible transactions of the Christians. And the Christians attacked them with buffets and beatings until finally they laid their hands on the nobles of the villages. Then they behaved with such temerity and shamelessness that the most powerful ruler of the islands had to see his own wife raped by a Christian officer. Right? So that gives you a sense of settlement and discovery, which really are misnomers, perhaps, for conquest. And from this time on, from 1493 onwards, Europe maintains a permanent presence in the West Indies. Columbus finds the mainland of South America during the 1498 voyage. He finds Central America during the 1502. The Italians and Portuguese at that point were exploring the coasts of both South and North America, beginning in 1515 under Charles V. The grandson of Ferdinand and Isabella. The Spanish enter Mexico, Florida, the Isthmus of Panama. Cortez is conquering the Aztecs 20 years after this. Only 50 years after 1492, in other words, the Europeans have managed to explore the east coast almost completely. They've made major inroads into the continent, and they've defeated the most advanced American civilizations, which are the ones in the south, the Aztecs and the Incas. 50 years after Columbus discovers the New World, the Europeans are there to stay. And in some sense, the history that we are now talking about begins. Now, part of the problem I've mentioned is that the Indians weren't thought to have a civilization in part because they didn't have writing. They didn't have a written literature, but they did have an oral literature. And I give you to read, I asked you to take a look at the 2 pieces that the Norton reprints for us, the Iroquois creation story and the Pima creation story, just to give you the sense that there was something here before the European, and it was a culture. It wasn't just a bunch of barbarians who were no better than animals, right? They had a culture. But the way they expressed their culture was oral. And therefore, the Europeans were unable to understand it as a culture. Some anthologies of colonial America choose instead to present to you the gap. They don't present any of these texts, because these texts are problematic. For one thing, anytime you get a written version of an oral text, you're just getting one performance of it. So you've lost something about the essential nature, the orality of the text, not only because you don't hear it spoken, but because an oral text lives with variations and it's passed on. Any single rendering of it is just one performance, as if I suppose we're used to doing this, is what a theater critic does. He goes or she goes one performance and makes a judgment about the way the entire play is, not wondering whether it's a particularly good night or a particularly bad night. So we need to keep that with a grain of salt. The other thing, of course, is that these are transcriptions of oral presentations, right? And therefore, they are mediated. There's somebody in between the oral presenter and the audience, who is the reader. Even, you might say, if that oral presenter is himself the writer or transcriber. So somebody who writes down an oral story is also mediating it for us. And there are, I think the Norton introducer and I disagree about the extent to which it seems likely that the second of these, the Pima stories, is actually mediated in that way. There are ways in which you might say a European audience would expect to see certain hallmarks of creation in a creation story. There should be a creator. If you are a believer in the literal truth of the Bible, you would say there had to be a flood. So these things work their way in. It's unclear whether they really were part of the extent to which they're part of the original story. So what you might say is what you're getting in some sense is a very damaged version of the original story that was here. Nevertheless, I think for our purposes, it's worth having even that damaged version to call attention to the way in which it's damaged, to bring it out of chronology. I mean, if we were actually going to read these in chronology in terms of the time they were produced, these are mid-19th century texts. They don't belong at the beginning of the course. But we have them here, to give us a sense of the injustice that's being done when we talk about something as virgin land, right? So I think it's important to remember that these Native American creation stories we should consider to be literary, but they belong to an oral rather than a written literary tradition. And that gesture that Columbus has in his first letter of naming, showing us the names that he's giving to the island, is actually an important thing. I mean, one of the things that you would say that the Europeans do is they go and name everything and take possession of you can stick a standard in the sand and unfurl your banner, you can bring in soldiers, but it's really when you start to rename everything and bring in your culture that you are actually taking possession of it. And so one of the things that we might say is that this has become a kind of understanding among many contemporary Native American artists and novelists about the way that the conquest worked. This is from a wonderful novel, which if any of you like 20th century literature, I would imagine that you should read this one. It's one of the brilliant novels, I think, of the late 20th century. It's Leslie Marmon Silko's Ceremony, which is about a Native American who has gone off to fight in World War II and comes back kind of shell-shocked and tries to reintegrate himself into his community. And it's kind of it looks at first glance like a kind of wonderful modernist text, but one of the things she's doing is trying to incorporate the oral tradition of the Laguna Pueblo Indians into a kind of Western novelistic tradition. This is one moment from that novel, and I think it's worth thinking about just for a second. This is describing a Christianized Indian she's the aunt of the protagonist, so she's referred to as Auntie. And the narrator tells us this: an old sensitivity had descended in her, surviving thousands of years from the oldest times, when the people shared a single clan name and they told each other who they were. They recounted the actions and words each of their clan had taken and would take. From before they were born and long after they died, the people shared the same consciousness. The people had known, with the simple certainty of the world they saw, how everything should be. Pre-Columbian. When people says pre-Columbian, that means before Columbus's discovery. So that's in some sense the pre-Columbian vision. The first four worlds. But the fifth world had become entangled with European names. The names of the rivers, the hills, the names of the animals and plants. All creation suddenly had two names, an Indian name and a white name. Christianity separated the people from themselves. It tried to crush the single clan name, encouraging each person to stand alone because Jesus Christ would save only the individual soul. Jesus Christ was not like the mother who loved and cared for them as her children, as her family. And you get a sense of that mother figure in one of the stories, right? In the Iroquois story, which is a story really that is very different from the account of creation that we would get in Genesis. Right? I mean, the Pima story is a little bit more like that, although again, it's not quite certain why. In the Iroquois story, we sort of start in the middle. There isn't like this moment of creation. There's a greater emphasis on motherhood, on process, on collaboration, on community. Again, in contrast to the kind of radical individualism that certainly from the Native American standpoint we would see in Christianity. And I think it's worth remembering this idea of individualism because it will become important as we go on. For much of U.S. ideology is predicated on the idea that individualism is a good thing, that it's created many good ideas like natural rights and other things like that, and that it really, we'll get to the flowering of it in Emerson, who will talk about self-reliance as the way to develop not only a person but a culture. So you might say that our liberal system is based on the idea of individualism. It's a strange idea from another cultural perspective. Silko gets at that, and I think some of these stories will suggest that as well. A different kind of culture, in other words, is going to come out of a creation story like the Iroquois than out of a creation story like the one that we find in Genesis. Compare the Iroquois mother of the world in that story, therefore, to the male God figure that in the Christian tradition. The monsters in the dark are not evil in the way that Satan later on and his devils are evil. They belong, you might say, to a different way of thinking about the world, and they come together. They collaborate in the creation. So when the good twin begins the work of creation, it can't be completed until the bad twin is able to partake in that. So I think that that's a really quick way of sketching, you might say, some of the limits of the ideological tradition that comes along to the New World with Christianity. So I want you to look at those accounts and think about the ways in which they're even the Pima account is different in certain ways. Jawerta Mackay becomes a kind of trickster figure. He makes mistakes. Not that there aren't mistakes that are made. Human beings aren't acting so well. Let's wipe everybody out except for a single family and start again. So there's some of that in the Christian tradition as well. But you get the sense of more of a kind of trial and error process, kind of the creator figure as a kind of trickster even in the Pima account. And he makes the world 4 times until he's satisfied, which scholars think corresponds to the emphasis that's placed on the number 4 in many native cosmologies, including the Pima, which would correspond, say, to the 4 directions as a kind of significant number, right? So I want just to put those out there for you as a way of indicating something like this was here and a lot more of it, and we can't ever really know what it was like. That's what cultural theorists would call a situation of cultural damage. The cultural damage is profound. Some tribes are completely wiped out. The Puritans go and wipe out the Pequots later on. That'll become important to our friend Ishmael. Okay, so again, I want to just emphasize that contrast between the oral and the literary traditions. Now, I want to talk a little bit. Okay, we'll do it this way. I wanted to talk to you a little bit about the ways in which the Puritans interpret the Bible that will help you to read some of the stuff to think about some of the stuff that you've read already and to read the stuff that you're going to start to read over the weekend, which include John Winthrop's very famous Sermon, A Model of Christian Charity, and then later on the account of the captivity of Mary Rowlandson. So one thing to understand is that the Puritans have a particular, and you will have a piece, which you definitely should read carefully, by Bruce Kuklick, which will go over this same material. So I'm going to give it to you now. You can read it, and then you can start to understand, because I think you will find, in a way, that it's kind of counterintuitive at first, or at least paradoxical. One thing to understand about the Puritans, I talked a lot about cosmopolitanism in the first couple of classes. The Puritans are what we would call counter-cosmopolitans. They are fundamentalists. And whatever it is you think of fundamentalism, you should think that about the Puritans. I mean, they are people who believe that they have the one true way. They believe that in the old world, in England especially, they are being persecuted for following the one true way. Right? You remember a little bit of your English history? There's a whole big reformation that's going on in Europe. The English are a little bit late to the party, and it's not for the best reasons. Henry VIII decides he, needs a male heir, is tired of his Catholic Spanish wife, so he decides to divorce her. Slight problem with that. Catholics can't divorce. So what's the solution? Let's not be Catholic anymore. So Henry VIII founds the Anglican Church, becomes the head of the church, grants himself his own divorce, and marries Anne Boleyn. It doesn't work out so well either. He keeps going on until he finally gets a male heir who doesn't last very long, and is succeeded by his eldest daughter, with Catherine of Aragon, Mary I. She has another name, a nickname. We drink it. Some of us drink it. Bloody Mary, yes. Why is she called Bloody Mary? Actually, she should be called something like Roasty Mary, because what she did was burn a lot of Puritans at the stake. And then Elizabeth, who is a Protestant, succeeds her, and things switch around again. But Elizabeth, the Puritans don't like Elizabeth much more either. Elizabeth is a great politician, so she's trying to mediate between the different religious constituencies that she has. So you have to imagine that in this period, it's the Catholics who are the right-wingers, right? They represent the conservatives, the long tradition of the church. The Puritans are big left-wingers. That's what I mean by slightly counterintuitive, because the way that the cultural situation has turned around, if you found a Puritan in front of you today, you would think of them as right-wing in comparison to our current ideological alignment. But then they're the lefties. And the Anglicans are somewhere in the center, right? I mean, some people say that when Henry VIII changed the church around, all he did was basically translate the liturgy out of Latin and into English and left it there, but you were still going to find a lot of incense and all kinds of other rituals in high Episcopal services. The Puritans don't like any of that. They think it's all kind of graven images. They think the church has become, and perhaps rightly so, they think it's become this bloated institution which has gotten away from the true faith. When was the church great? In the early years, the years of the first apostles and martyrs, when the saints were walking amongst us. They think of themselves as returning to those days. That's what they're trying to do. They're trying to create small congregations that are going to mirror the early church. And luckily for them, in fact, they have a Catholic persecuting monarch who's creating new martyrs and new saints. One of their revered books in this period is a book that's called Fox's Book of Martyrs that talks about all this. So the Puritans come to create a theocracy, quite literally. Separation of church and state, they would find that idea ludicrous. For them, church is state. It's the only reason to have a state. Now, they bring with them a particular interpretation of the Old and New Testaments and the relationship between the Old and New Testaments. And you might say that there's some key books for them. Certainly Genesis and the account of the fall are key books. The Gospels. Some of the epistles of St. Paul, as we'll talk about a little bit with Winthrop. Because there's a certain part of Paul's message that they want to adopt and a certain other part that they want to leave aside. And then the book of Revelation. Why the book of Revelation? Again, think of the Puritans. The Berkovich article in the Puritan Vision of the New World is very good on this, I think. They have a different sense of history than we have. We live in what they would think of as secular history or debased history. They live in a sense of sacred history. And it's comforting to live in sacred history in a certain way because, you know what? There's a roadmap in sacred history. What is that roadmap? Yeah, it's the Bible. It starts in Genesis, has a few bumps along the way, but eventually it leads to the day of judgment. And they like the day of judgment. Why? Because they think they're living close to the end times, and they think they are God's chosen people recreated. I mean, they think they are, in fact, you would say, they think they are really the ones who are God's chosen people. The previous version of God's chosen people was just a warm-up for them. So they think of themselves as living in the end of days. And they're looking forward to that. Second coming of Christ and all that comes with it. So they go back and, under the influence of John Calvin, they start to interpret the Bible in a certain way. They think of the Bible as, in Genesis, establishing a covenant. God establishes a covenant between himself and humankind, between himself and Adam. They regard this as the covenant. It's called the covenant of works. And it's a kind of strange title, but what it basically means is that given the nature of that covenant, all of Adam's works were going to be good. Because why? Adam didn't know the difference between good and evil. There was no distinction between good and evil. So all of Adam's works are guaranteed to be good, so long as Adam obeyed God. And God pretty much said, you can have all these beasts, and depending on which version you pay more attention to. How many of you have actually read Genesis? Have you ever noticed that there's certain kinds of repetition in Genesis? It's like there's one creation of the world in which Eve has a certain role and gets created in a certain time. And then somehow, a few verses later, there's another one, and she gets created out of the rib. Have you ever read the story of Noah? Everybody remember the story of the dove and Noah? And how many days? 40 days and 40 nights? That's the one you remember? Who remembers the raven in Noah? There are two different versions of the Noah story. And the Bible, if you do source studies of the Bible, which they started to do in the 19th century, you find that there are different sources. And there is thought to be an editor, a redactor figure, who brought these things together. And sometimes the seams show. It's kind of a wonderful exercise. It's kind of beyond the point here. People who are in my Conquest class have seen this. But I might put up, if you're interested, I'll put up a little piece that you can read about this. But the Noah story is wonderful because you could actually pull them apart almost perfectly and read one entire account written by one source that tells a story that features a dove, and an entire other account that works in its own logic, features a raven instead. One of them has 40 days and 40 nights, the other has a slightly different chronology. The two of them, however, are intertwined with one another in the actual text. There have been attempts to say that, in fact, they aren't separate, that they go together, and that, in fact, you could make a kind of chronological sense of all of this. I would suggest that you just read it and take a look and see what you think yourself. In any case, there is this idea, in at least one version of the story, that Adam is basically supposed to go and he's God's agent on the ground. He's going to name things, he's going to take possession, and the world's created for his dominion. So long as he obeys one little rule. Do not touch the fruit of that tree over there. That tree over there happens to be the... Well, so it could go by the tree of knowledge, but it also has a longer name, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Puritans, diehard Calvinists would probably say, you know what? God could have picked any tree. This has theological implications. Because you could say, if it's the tree of the knowledge of good and evil that God doesn't want people to eat from, it's because he specifically doesn't want them to know the difference between good and evil, so that there presumably wouldn't be evil. Others would say, you know what? It's the thing that's important is just God's commandment. It could have been the tree of the recipe of how to make sugar cookies. And he could have decided that was it. So basically, it was obedience that was fundamentally what was at stake, not the knowledge of good and evil. Okay. Either way, covenant of works. So you know the story, right? The serpent, is that right? Not exactly right. Satan, but he's not the serpent yet. He's some other form that we don't know. He talks to Eve, has a little chat with her. Says, tree tastes pretty good, actually. God's not going to mind that much. Have it. It's good stuff. So she has it. And then she goes to her husband, and either because he's seen what she's done and he realizes he's got to take part in it, or just because he's convinced that it's good stuff, he eats it too. What happens next?
They're chased from the garden.
Okay, before they're chased from the garden, what's the first thing they know? What? They realize they're naked, so they cover themselves. I want you to remember that conjunction, especially when we get to the Scarlet Letter, which I hope will look radically different to you with me than it does by the time we get to it than it did in high school. But there's something about, look at the connection that's being made there. If you assume that the knowledge of good and evil is important, the Puritans are going to say, what's the first bit of knowledge that's evil that they know? Stuff about sex. And it's the woman's fault. Yeah, I mean, just think about it. The Catholic tradition, I'm being a little irreverent, but not much. The Catholic tradition reveres the Virgin Mary. There's no kind of feminist counterweight, equivalent in the Puritan tradition. It's much more patriarchal and much more difficult for women. I think that will give you, if you keep that in mind, you'll get a real sense of the achievement of Mary Rowlandson and Bradstreet as writers. So we'll get to that next week and the week after. But they know they have the knowledge of good and evil all of a sudden, and it has everything to do with sexuality. So sexuality and knowledge, very important. Hawthorne gets this, and that's why he writes the story that he does. And when you get to it, you might, or if you've read it, you'll remember that she's being punished for a sexual sin that she has been proven to have committed. But in the course of what looks like her penance, she is sinning a lot more. But these are sins of intellect. And there's a connection that's being made between those two things. Okay, so covenant of works, broken, chased out of the garden of evil. Satan takes the form of the serpent now, which is now taking the form that we know it has, which is that it's forced to wriggle on its belly, and it has an enmity forever with man and woman. Human beings have to toil for their labor. They have to, instead of just getting nice fruit off the tree, you got to work, got to plant stuff, got to kill stuff. Women, whoo. Childbirth. This doesn't mean anything to most of you, I presume most of you yet, but childbirth. I've seen childbirth way up close, not experienced it myself, but seen it. Painful. I mean, when you look at it, you say, who made up this system? But then if you say, oh, but it was punishment. Okay. But the thing about God, the God of the Old Testament, however, is a loving God. He's very severe. But the Israelites are always the chosen people, and he is constantly chastising them, but he always cares about them. That's one thing. Even when they're in captivity, in prison, they know that they are the chosen people and that it will work out. They have that assurance. They have that promise. So that's one thing to understand. Now, the New Testament is a different story, right? From the Old Testament, we get the doctrine of original sin. The doctrine of original sin is a bit problematic because, why should all of humankind be punished for one guy's mistake? And you might say, especially if you believe, as I think I've mentioned already, that God knows, that whole bit about providence at the end of the first chapter of Moby Dick, God knows that Adam's going to do this. Is it really Adam's fault? Didn't he kind of set up a situation? It's like using reverse psychology on my 4-year-old. Don't eat the tree fruit. As soon as he's going to, you can't possibly dress yourself before I come into the room, can you? I'm sure you can't. So is it really, come on, is it really Adam's fault? Fine. And all that stuff that's going on is happening pretty quick as far as we can tell, so Adam hasn't had a chance to learn very much. But God is merciful. So the doctrine of original sin is really bad. The doctrine of original sin means not only do you have to work and bear live birth and all that messy stuff, but you know what? You're also going to hell at the end of it. Yes, human beings are now eternally damned. Really, damned. I mean it. The hot place. You're going to hell. That's what the Puritans believe. That is the meaning of doctrine of original sin. It will have a name, and it'll be called total depravity. But God is merciful. Human beings deserve nothing, but God does still love them. So he creates a new deal. The new deal is another covenant. It's called by the Puritans the covenant of grace. Anybody have any idea who it is that seals his bargain? Yes, I've heard it. Yes? Jesus Christ, that's right. God's only begotten Son comes down to the world to extend God's mercy. So, what does Jesus do? He sacrifices himself, right? There's a certain way in which the Old Testament is still partaking of a certain kind of older logic of sacrifice. Remember that Jesus is Jewish. He founds Christianity, but he's Jewish. He sacrifices himself on the cross as the supreme act of love, and we'll talk about that. That's the interpretation that they get from Paul. Paul is the one. If you think about if you're skeptical of Christianity for any reason, and you say, why do Christians revere that kind of bloody crucifix? It's because they don't see it that way. They see it as the supreme symbol of love, somebody who loved other people so much that he was willing to undergo that. And you might say that kind of wipes out the books. Human beings owed God more than they could possibly repay because of the doctrine of original sin. But Christ suffers so much that he wipes out the books. Whoops. And that is the new covenant, and it's the covenant of grace. And according to Puritan logic, covenant of grace actually better than the covenant of works. Covenant of works is fine. You get to stay in the Garden of Eden. It's nice scenery, good food. But God is above. Covenant of grace? Where did those who have received grace get to be? Garden of Eden? No. At God's right hand with the angels up there. It's better. So there's a certain logic that's in place there. This was good, and we broke it, and we suffered, but we got that, which is better. It's through suffering that we achieve something even greater. Okay. This mode of thinking is called typology. And the larger mode of thinking, we might say, is typological hermeneutics. So a hermeneutic is a way of interpreting, and hermeneutics, plural, is, you might say, the science of interpretations. When you put it together into this phrase, it means a way of interpreting through typology. And typology, and it's a way of interpreting fundamentally first the Bible. Now, typology depends on the existence of types and antitypes. And they don't mean exactly what you think they're going to mean. Type is the first thing. And you might imagine that what a type is, I don't know if this is still, on the day of the iPad, this seems radically anachronistic to be saying this. But it's like a font of type. Maybe I should say like a stamp pad. Maybe like the die that you use to create a coin. It's the kind of reverse image. So you take your stamp pad, you ink it, and you stamp. What is it that you care about? The stamp itself? No. You care about the image that you created. The image is the antitype. The type is a kind of reversal of the type, antitype. The type prepares the way for the antitype. The type's meaning only comes clear when you encounter the antitype. You don't care about the stamper, you care about the image that's produced. You don't care about the die that produces about the coin, you care about the coin. That's the relationship. Now, in the Puritan understanding, the Old Testament is full of types. That's what they are. All those, like the recurrence of 40 days, 40 nights, Mount Ararat, 40 days, all prefigures Christ out in the desert, struggling with Satan and his conscience for 40 days and 40 nights. The meaning of 40 days and 40 nights only becomes clear through the life of Christ. And you can pick any one of a number of things. If you actually go back and read the Gospel according to St. Matthew especially, you will see that he is very concerned to show that some of the things that Christ does fulfill Scripture. And that's what we mean by fulfillment. Christ is the fulfillment of what has been predicted or foreshadowed in the Old Testament. And so it has that relationship. It's a way of reading the Bible, in other words, that gives pride of place to the New Testament over the Old Testament, and that says that the Old Testament is like John the Baptist. It has a kind of preparatory relationship for the New Testament. Okay. This is all really comes out of their understanding, comes out of Calvin's institutes of the Christian religion. The Puritans, so this is on the eve of Bradford and the other Puritans coming to the New World in 1620. There's a big meeting of church elders in Holland called the Synod of Dort. And they agree on a kind of official interpretation of Calvin's institutes. And that's the one that they start to put into practice in the New World. It begins with this idea that comes out of original sin. The total depravity of humankind. And I mean total, right? You're totally depraved, you're going to hell. Period. You're born, you're going to hell. However, because God is merciful, there's a thing called unconditional election that takes place. This doesn't mean you vote. This means that you become among the elect, which means you are saved and you receive grace. And it's called unconditional because there's no strings attached to it. Not on God's end and not on yours. There is nothing that you can do to earn this. This is the point that I have to stress. For the Puritans, there is no way to do enough good works to pay off your debt. Only Christ could pay off your debt. So, there is no way that good works can earn your way into heaven. And if you think that's true, for them that's a heresy. They call it the Arminian heresy after the Dutch thinker Jacob Arminius who propounded it. So any idea of good works getting you into heaven? No. You could be the worst sinner in the world, but if you're converted and you receive grace, boom, you're in. The best person in the world, not receive grace, sorry, gates barred to you. Unconditional election. And you know what? There's another hitch. I forgot to mention. Did I mention? Christ died for not quite everybody's sins. He died for those who were already going to be elect. So Christ's atonement for these sins is limited. Christ died for the chosen people. And who are the chosen people? Funny how that works, right? The Puritans are the chosen people. But good thing is grace is nice and irresistible. I mean, when you read accounts, as we will, a little bit of receiving grace, it's like, whoa. And guess what? Once you have it, you always have it. Perseverance of the saints. Actually, it's probably more correct to use the language of French theory and say you always already had it, because God always already knew who was going to receive grace and who wasn't. So these are 5 principles that I would like you to remember. They will help you as you read the Puritans. Can anybody think of a way? No con Westies. Thank you. Yes, TULIP. Total depravity of humankind, unconditional election, limited atonement, irresistible grace, perseverance of the saints. TULIP. Okay. Are there any questions about this? What's the next slide? I'm not going to play that one yet. We are almost, as you can tell, at the end, but I want to know if there's any questions about this. Yes, none. Well, we'll talk about this. I mean, the goal is, the Puritans hope that all of them are going to have been saved. But the goal is, in their theocracy here in the New World, they want to try to create a church that is close to what they will call the invisible church. So it's God's church that is actually real and that actually exists in heaven and in God's mind. They want to mirror that on earth. So they really want only the chosen to be there. But then there's a kind of epistemological problem. How do we know who's chosen and who isn't? I mean, it goes without saying that John Winthrop or William Bradford, they're chosen, right? And what about their kids? Kids don't seem to have had the grace experience. That proves to be a problem later on, and they have to figure out ways to deal with it, right? So there's a couple of weird paradoxes that I want you to be thinking about. One is that if God has already chosen all this, how can there be anything like free will? How would that work? How can we have an idea of providence and what's called predestination and also have free will at the same time? Don't those constitute mutually exclusive ideas? So that's one thing the Puritans are going to wrestle with. The other is how do you know if you had the signs of grace? And it's going to be really important if you're trying to create a society and even a politics that's based on this. You've got to know who's in and who's out. But only God knows really who's in and who's out. So you've got to figure out ways of guessing. That's one of the upshots of this. But what I want you to see is the way in which, when you start to think of the Puritanic gloom, the way Melville talks about it, the way in which what we have here is a kind of haunted imagination. Everything means something. Nothing is neutral. Typological hermeneutics starts as a way of reading the Bible, but it becomes a way for the Puritans to read history and their own daily experience. In other words, if, strictly speaking, typological hermeneutics is a way of reading the New Testament, of reading the Old Testament in the light of the New, or the way of reading New Testament that says that's the fulfillment of the Bible, for the Puritans, typological hermeneutics starts as that, but it radically becomes something else. It becomes a way of reading their own history and experience and seeing the entire Bible as a type that they are fulfilling, or full of types of which they are the fulfillment. They are, they say, the latter-day Israelites. That means the previous Israelites only mean something with the appearance of the Puritans. It's only with the appearance of the Puritans who are the antitype. The meaning of the Israelites, who are the types, finally becomes clear and fulfilled. That's, you might say, the ultimate hubris of their way of thinking. But it's comforting in a certain way. Because when things start to go bad here in the New World, and like Avatar, the New World kills a lot of them, they have comfort because they know it's for a purpose. They know that God cares about them. And when things go really bad, you can say, they blame themselves. They say, God is punishing us. But it's only because he wants us to get back on the straight and narrow. It's not unlike, we break the covenant that we made with him. And Winthrop will use this language of covenant. But we can always reestablish it just because there's a precedent for that. Covenant of works to covenant of grace, we can always reestablish it. We are still God's chosen people. That's comforting for them. But it means, to go back to Nandini's point, they're always trying to figure out ways of understanding what things mean. So the littlest thing can be read typologically. And these things are. People look at daily events and try to understand them. But you understand that they've got this kind of template. It's another template. Columbus has the template of wonder. These guys have the template of typological hermeneutics. Let me give you one instance of this, and then we can be done for the day. Take a look at, if you have it with you, take a look at the piece that's called Mort's Relation. And you can see, okay, if you've got this thing printed out, which I hope you do, take that out, and then at the same time go to the first volume of the anthology and turn to page 116. Now, this Mort's Relation is something that was a pamphlet. It was published in England in 1622. It's thought to have been written by William Bradford and Edward Winslow in the colonies and brought back by this guy named George Morton to be printed. And it's kind of, not unlike Columbus's letter, it's kind of like a pitch. It's almost like a prospectus for further colonization, and it's a kind of justification. So when you read it, you will see that in some sense it partakes of that same kind of discourse of wonder right? They get to, on Wednesday the 6th of September, the wind coming east-northeast, a fine small gale, we loosed from Plymouth. Having been entertained, kindly and courteously used by diverse friends we had there dwelling, and many difficulties and boisterous storms, at length by God's providence, upon the 9th of November following, at the break of day, we espied land upon which we deemed to be Cape Cod, and so afterward it proved. And the appearance of much comforted us, especially feeling so goodly a land and wooded to the brink of the sea, it caused us to rejoice together and praise God that had given us once again to see land. And if you read through it, you see that they just can't believe. Again, like Columbus, they're comparing it to what they know, and they can't believe how lush it is. A little bit later on, circled around except at an entrance, which is about 4 miles over from land to land, compassed to the very sea with oaks, pines, juniper, sassafras, and other sweet wood. It is a harbor where 1,000 sail of ships may safely ride. Good to know for the future, right, if we want other people to be able to come here. And then at the end, then they start exploring the shore a little in a shallop, which is a little ship. And the very last paragraph we have. As soon as we could, we set ashore 15 or 16 men well armed with some to fetch wood, for we had none left, so as to see what the land was and what inhabitants they could meet with. They found it to be a small neck of land. On this side where lay is the bay, and the further side the sea, the ground or earth sandhills, much like the downs in Holland, but much better. The crust of the earth, a spits deep, excellent black earth, all wooded with, he mentions, oaks, pines, sassafras, juniper, birch, holly, vine, some ash, walnut. The wood, for the most part, open and underwood, fit either to go or ride in. At night our people returned, but found not any person. Unlike Columbus, they don't see anybody at first. Not any person, nor habitation, and laded their boat with juniper, which smelled very sweet and strong, and of which we burnt the most part of the time we lay there. Okay? Again, this pamphlet partakes in the discourse of wonder. Go 10 years into the future, and you get Bradford writing the history now of Plymouth Plantation. And if you look on the bottom of page 116 at chapter 10, you will see an interesting date. Being thus arrived at Cape Cod the 11th of November, and necessity calling them to look out a place for habitation, as well as the masters and mariners' importunity, they having brought a large shallop with them out of England, stowed in shores in the ship, they now got her out and set their carpenters to work to trim her up, but being much bruised and shattered in the ship with foul weather, they saw she would be long in mending. Okay, we've got the same dates. This is another account of the same event. And they talk about, he goes on and talks about all of this stuff that's going on here. One of the things I want you to see is the way in which Bradford is rewriting. From the time that he gets from Mort's relation to this, he is rewriting. And the way to understand how the rewriting works is through typology. Right? So what I want you to do over the weekend is to go back right before the place that I've just brought you, which is chapter 9, which starts off September 6th, which is the same place that the excerpt from Mort's relation. And what I want you to think about is, what is the difference between this later account and the account that we see in Mort's relation? What has Bradford done to filter his account through the idea of typological hermeneutics? Where would you find moments of typological thinking? You should be looking for moments where he's comparing the Puritans, say, to the saints earlier on. What is the logic of those comparisons? Who had it worse, the apostles being shot at or these guys? And remember this idea of the lush, wonderful wilderness that they've come to in Mort's relation. How is it portrayed here? Is it the same kind of wilderness, or is it something else? And if it's something else, why portray it in that way? One last thing, and this you would find probably in the middle, the signal place to look at, the exemplary place to look at would probably be in the middle of 115. He says they didn't find anybody. But in the Plymouth Plantation, he brings those people that they didn't find into his account right here in a particular way. Why do that? What's the point? Okay? This is one of the earliest books, we might say. The Plymouth Plantation is one of the very earliest histories of the Americas, of North America. And the thing to understand is that at the moment, you might say, that American history writing is being created, It's revisionist history. It's rewriting. Why? That's where we'll start when we start next week. Thank you.